Hello and welcome to the Trust and Influence in B2B podcast. I'm your host, Joel Harrison. As the title suggests, this podcast is a broad remit covering all the evolving challenges associated with generating trust and influencing buyers in all areas of B2B marketing. And these are perennially tough challenges, but they're taken on a new urgency and resonance in what's very much a changing landscape. Episodes are released weekly, so please don't forget to subscribe and better still, like or rate the podcast or episode. So today, we're going to focus on what's a hot topic of B2B, and particularly around thought leadership, and that's synthetic data. The availability and quality of data in any form has always been one of the biggest challenges in B2B marketing, particularly in market research, where it's becoming harder and harder to generate robust conclusions and have size samples. So a means of using AI to shortcut or improve the quality of this process has been created with much interest and enthusiasm by marketers, as well as hype from providers and some agencies. But is it too good to be true? Is synthetic data good enough to provide genuinely reliable insights to inform marketing now or ever? That's what I'm going to be talking about with my guest today, who is Lynsey Showman from Adience. Lynsey has over 20 years' experience as a market research professional, and Adience is one of a rare group of MR agencies specializing in B2B. In this podcast, you'll learn what synthetic data is, where it comes from, and how it promises to transform the B2B market research specialism, and indeed opportunities using it for thought leadership, which is one of the topics of this podcast. And you'll also learn about the challenges and limitations of synthetic data in its current form and considerations for future usage. So that's what we're going to set out to talk about. So Lynsey, welcome. Great to talk to you today.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
And looking forward to digging into all your experience and background on this topic. I know it's an emerging area, but just I understand your context of it, your reading of it in terms of how it's evolving and emerging. So let's just talk a little bit about your background. You've been in market research for a long time. That's correct?
Yeah, that is correct. So I've been in it for such a long time that I was here for the kind of last digital transformation in the industry, which is when we moved from face-to-face to digital surveys. And so here we are again in another era. But yeah, I have a background in B2C and B2B market research. And as you say, now specialize solely in B2B.
What is it about market research that fascinates you so much? It's a very particular discipline, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I've always been curious about what people think and what people feel. I think it's very easy to walk around thinking of ourselves as average, and therefore thinking that the average Joe will have the same opinion as us. And I think when you start to scratch beneath the surface and actually ask questions of others, you realize that that is not actually the case. And so I have always been fascinated by how different types of people think and feel in different settings, in different contexts. And I think ultimately as researchers, we're a naturally nosy bunch, and essentially using that to help other organizations and companies influence their decisions by being the voice of other people and advising on what they think.
Okay, so digging under that's psychology part of it. What do people think and what do they feel? And sometimes those beliefs are quite complex, aren't they? Not always necessarily logical, sometimes quite emotional, which is often what a B2B is all about.
Yes, and definitely a theme we'll be touching on today.
Okay, well, that's great. Looking forward to it. Okay, so let's say the topic today is synthetic data, and this is a buzzword which I've started to hear a lot about recently. So let's start by understanding what it is and how it's potentially relevant for B2B marketing. So can you give us a kind of what's your summary on a very quick way of describing what synthetic data is in a particular market research context, right? Because there could be other forms of synthetic data that are used across different areas of B2B.
Yeah, absolutely. So synthetic data, really, we're talking about artificially generated information. It's created either by algorithms or AI. And what it does is it mimics real data without containing real responses or personal details. Now, the idea isn't entirely new, and it's not entirely new in research, because we've all been for many years working with AI-driven analytics, predictive modeling. I'm sure most people who've come across research might be aware of something like a conjoint study trade-off, where we're kind of simulating responses based on the data that we do hold. But this is different, because ultimately we are not just analyzing existing data when we're talking about synthetic data. Synthetic respondents, which is going to be the key theme of today, actively participate in research. They answer new questions for us. So they provide answers just like a human respondent would, but it is synthetic.
Okay. So there's lots to dig into in that. So it sounds like it's potentially not as completely new as we might have thought it would be. And you're kind of creating responses based on those pertain to real individuals, but they're not real individuals. So that's quite a complicated thing to do. And I'm mindful that you're not an AI expert, you're a market research expert. So I don't want to ask you unfair questions that are going to be hard for you to kind of answer. But I mean, these are invented people. These are real individuals, aren't real humans. So do you have a perspective about how it actually does that? Is it extrapolating or guessing?
Yeah, absolutely. So ultimately, it starts with data collection. The gathering of, for example, it might be historical survey data, it might be CRM records, panelist profiles, even third-party data sets. Any information that can be held about a potential target audience. And that is the starting point, existing data.
So it's not just coming completely out of the ether, right? There's basis of facts and reality at the core of it.
In order to create synthetic data, we need to train it on existing data sets. So those data sets are our foundation. They're the starting point. Once we've got that data together, then comes the model training. Now, this might be algorithms, or what we're hearing a lot about these days is LLMs. And really what it's doing is it's looking for those relationships in the data. So, for example, how do respondent attributes, and in our world of B2B, we might be talking about industry, job title, company size, certain behaviors. How do they impact how we then respond to other things that are put in front of us? Once we've kind of created those models, then ultimately the trained model can start to generate synthetic respondents that statistically resemble that starting point, the training data. Now, in order for this to gain traction, of course, that is not the end. And particularly at the moment, before it becomes kind of commonplace, validation of the synthetic data is absolutely crucial and something I'll talk a little bit about. So the final stage is validating, and that might be literally running a few questions through the synthetic data, but also through real humans who we match in terms of profile, and just checking that the answers that we're seeing are both representative and logical in our synthetic data set.
Okay. So there's just kind of the levels of the process to go through. And I guess different providers are going to have different approaches to doing this. And by definition, they're going to try and find different ways of addressing the same problem. And I suppose inherently there are you might have a different judgment call on the level of robustness of each different provider might be having. Is that a nebulous but fair statement?
Yes, it is. And I think what is really key here is scratching beneath the surface of the training data itself. Because ultimately, any biases, for example, in that data are often amplified in the synthetic data that is trained from it. So it is really important when going to a provider for synthetic data that the source is transparent and that we can kind of understand the representativity of that starting point, because ultimately everything else is irrelevant if that isn't kind of robust and representative.
It's exactly the same as any other form of data analysis in B2B, or indeed anything. Rubbish in, rubbish out, right? The better the input, the better the output's going to be.
Yeah. And I think we'll come to talk about kind of why synthetic data is gaining such traction in the world of B2B, because there are definitely some advantages that relate to the world of B2B. But where it is a challenge is that there are, and this would be a whole other podcast, there are huge challenges with B2B panel. At Adience, we are not fans of using kind of panel sample for B2B, high prevalence of bots, and often consumers masquerading as professionals. And when you try and dig deep on a particular topic, it soon becomes clear that they perhaps aren't the professional they say they are. Now, if that is then the training data for synthetic sample, you can see how there might be some challenges in place. Now, that's not to say it can't be used, but it's just to say, again, that understanding the source and digging deep into that, it is really relevant, because some of the challenges that exist in more traditional methods could be amplified here.
Yeah, I guess it's this kind of the question which we've kind of prepared for before, which is what challenges might it overcome and what are the kind of use cases? I mean, I guess the use cases are probably better to start possibly from there, Lynsey, because, market research, we're talking about market research specifically here. It should be I would contend should be underpinning any B2B marketing campaign you're doing, because you've got to understand what your customers think. You can't do it without, otherwise it's guesswork. But it's all kinds of things, and thought leadership is a big part of this as well. So, I guess Adience, you're working with all kinds of B2B organizations to help them provide some foundational knowledge to actually enable them to do effective marketing.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think some of the challenges it overcomes, really, it helps us find hard to access professionals. And this is why I talk about the traction that it's gaining in B2B, because this is a barrier that is more prevalent in the world of B2B than B2C. Often it can be difficult to recruit the people that we're interested in the volumes that we would like, due to them being quite niche. Just ultimately, there aren't as many of them, even if we could actively engage them all in research. And sometimes there are even like corporate restrictions in place. So overcome some of those barriers. We talk about kind of large, robust samples being like the ideal if we're doing quant, for example, but it's not always possible for those reasons to get to the large samples. So we can now start to augment human sample with synthetic sample in order to boost those numbers. And again, that's a theme I imagine that we'll come back to today. Time is often a barrier. Now, I was at the B2B Marketing conference a few months ago, where synthetic data definitely got a good airing, lots of people talking about it as this golden bullet. And one of the advantages that was cited there was the speed of research, that often there were kind of two big barriers to those within the kind of B2B marketing world to doing research: budget and time. And ultimately, it is believed that synthetic data can really help to overcome both of those. It is more cost effective, and it doesn't take as long, because you're removing the time needed to find the right people, engage them in research, contact them at a time that's suitable. Ultimately, what many professionals are is time poor. So, you need to get a slot in the diary, or convince them to dedicate some of their time to doing a survey. So those barriers are removed. The cost efficiencies, ultimately you're removing the expense associated with recruiting these highly specialized respondents. So that's where that comes in. And then PI barriers, because sometimes the samples are so niche that even if you're not obviously listing the specific name and job title associated with the company, if you include certain identifiers about the role and the type of business, etc., actually you may be inadvertently reducing who this may be down to kind of just the small sample of people. In other words, it can be easy to identify. Well, if we're not talking about a human respondent, there is no personally identifiable information involved. So how does this tie into thought leadership, which is where your question originated? Ultimately, the best thought leadership utilizes research in some way or other. And you can then replicate that research. You were to believe that synthetic data, it has advantages that outweigh some of the disadvantages in the way we would think about a human sample. But for us, we would question whether thought leadership based solely on synthetic data is going to gain the traction that whoever is commissioning thought leadership is intended. Because often with thought leadership, the research itself comes under greater scrutiny. Are we at a point where synthetic data stand up to that scrutiny? Would probably argue not. So for us, in thinking about synthetic data and thought leadership, our advice at the moment would be that if it is to be used, it probably should be to augment human samples rather than to replace. And we'll come on later to some of the question areas that might be best avoided using synthetic data. Whereas there are others that it certainly is well placed.
Okay, that's really interesting. I mean, because I did wonder in terms of you made a point around, which is I can clearly very resonant, time and budget, right? And I wondered the other one, whether it actually part of the rationale, central rationale might be around quality, because of the limited sample size and all of the above, or even maybe not quality, the quality in terms of robustness. I guess there's depth of resonance, and there's the ability to interrogate that data in a kind of more nuanced and more meaningful way. I mean, is that potentially one of the use cases for this, or is that not really what you've understood people talking about?
This is an interesting one because there's so much written about it and quite polarized opinions. So unsurprisingly, those who have a stake in synthetic data, i.e. they sell synthetic samples, or they have invested in a business that do, will argue that one of the benefits is data quality, is that ultimately, because we're living in an age where we can't necessarily trust panel data, etc., it gets beyond some of those. On the other side, you've got those who absolutely do not have a stake in this world, but actually may offer recruitment for CATI interviews or face-to-face field work, or, they're at the other side of the spectrum. And they would argue that the quality isn't there yet. And therefore, I think it comes down to agencies perhaps like Adience and many others, where we don't have a stake in either of those extremes, and so can come to this with a kind of unbiased view. And for us, I think the quality point isn't yet strong enough to be talking about, and that's because the way in which synthetic data kind of falls out, even if you think about it like on a scaled question, for example, what it's doing is it's amplifying the extremes. Well, lots of people don't answer at the extremes on a scale, whether it's 5, 7, 10-point scale. There's lots of middling responses, and they're diluted at the moment in synthetic data sets. And so then it's very difficult to start making kind of quite big business decisions based on, likelihood to buy, if we are essentially overplaying some patterns of responses and underplaying others. So I think when it comes to quality, that combined with the lack of representativity that we're often seeing can be quite a challenge. And therefore, for us at the moment, the quality benefit isn't strong enough. Over time, I think it will be.
Okay, that's interesting. It sounds like where it's inevitably being pushed because its maturity is into that. Is, as you said, there's the budget or speed component. It's something that you'll use that is becoming an option if you're constrained in either one of those dimensions, which B2B marketers often are, to be fair. But yeah, it comes with a health warning around quality. That's my summary of what you just said.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, so as ever with these conversations, plan some questions out. We're jumping around quite a lot. But that's good fun. I mean, I appreciate your agility in responding to these. So I was going to ask you, is this data's always been the bête noire in B2B marketing, but is this? It doesn't sound like this is a silver bullet to solve all of our data market research problems. At least not now. But it sounds like it's emerging as an area of interest.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there are definitely some problems that it can solve for that I've talked about. So privacy, speed, cost, access. But at the moment, not a solution for everything. And there are some kind of other reasons for that I think would be useful to discuss today. The first is around emotional and subconscious decision making, because what we are finding, and this is quite consistent across all the literature that is currently available on the subject of synthetic data, is that the synthetic sample is unable to replicate these more emotional decision-making parts of a journey. The rational, we can replicate the rational. But ultimately, we know that whether we're talking to humans as consumers or humans as professionals, a lot of decisions are made on a gut feel, on nostalgia, on social influence. something that AI can't actually replicate at the moment. So what we then see is a lack of realism. Synthetic respondents, they're not able to capture those emotions. They can't deal with nuanced reasoning, or something that might be unexpected. You asked me kind of what keeps me in research or what I like about research. And obviously, I did lean in more to the emotional side because I think that is where the unexpected insight comes. And that's when you excite your audience. I think, oh, sorry, go on.
No, to finish off, I think it's brilliant. I'm really enjoying this. Carry on.
Okay, cool. So I think when just kind of going back to one of your previous questions on thought leadership, you're right in saying that at Adience, we do a huge amount of research that feeds into thought leadership. But it is those unexpected answers that kind of end up almost often dictating kind of the direction of the thought leadership report that it feeds into. So if we remove that, are we just left with something that's a bit more mundane, lacks the excitement? And then what does that do for us as insight professionals in terms of our reputation and the need to kind of bring in research? So I think for me, that is a big barrier that is currently in place.
Well, not only to be fair, not only to what does it do to the you as insight professionals, what does it do also to creative professionals, those who are creating thought leadership reports or indeed advertising, more kind of broadcast marketing activities. And particularly who's entered this era of B2B, where I think that we all accept now B2B marketing that it's emotion that drives decision making. And if we're extracting the emotional responses because they're unpredictable or unforeseeable, we're just left with this kind of kernel of rationality. Well, it could argue, is that going to add any value at all? But it's possibly another question, but it's another question for another time. But it's if that's where we've got to, it's a bit damning, it seems. So. That's really fascinating. Thank you, Lynsey. I mean, so clearly so I was going to ask you actually, because you talked about it's not in this issue of not exposing the emotional or unexpected stuff. That's a concern. Are there any trust issues in terms of, and we talked a little bit around it, possibly amplifying bias. So are there any other trust implications of incentive? I mean, can we essentially trust this data? Is it essentially unreliable, or is it just that perhaps it may skew the data in a way that is unhelpful?
Yeah. So I think there are a few trust issues. The first is validity. So is the data, we talk about the amplified bias, is it sufficiently representative? Is it accurate? Then there's transparency. So the data generation methods. So for the training data that I talked about, are the sources clear? Diversity. Now, diversity is an interesting one because you'll get some talking about synthetic data being the answer to diversity challenges in research samples. But actually, if you are looking at a general data set, what you will often find is because it has to be trained on data where often some of the more diverse groups are underrepresented, you are then underrepresenting those in your training data. So that can be quite challenging. And then the richness that I talked about. So as you say, will marketers be losing access to that unexpected depth or the context that you get via that human interaction? So importantly, how can these be overcome? I think there are kind of three main considerations. Interrogate, blend, and validate. So interrogate the source. What data sets have been used for training? So I think if you know that, it means you're armed if anyone starts to question it internally. For us, we're very much thinking about this as something that you blend. You blend with the human sample to kind of boost those responses, etc. Because then that really helps with the next point, which is validate. Because we are still at the stage of requiring validation. Synthetic data is not at the point where people will instantly trust that it is correct. And so the validation stage is key. And I talked about, when we moved from physical questionnaires, standing on the street with a pen and paper, we're going knocking on doors, to digital. There was a huge phase of validation. Now, today, that might seem totally alien to people who've been brought up in the world of digital surveys, online surveys being the norm. But for the first kind of 2 to 3 years, if not more, we always were having to validate in order to showcase to clients that you can trust data that comes from an online survey versus having the interviewer. So in the same way, I imagine that validation will start to dilute in terms of the need for it. But for now, absolutely, that is imperative if we're looking to drive trust with synthetic data.
Okay, and just along the lines of that, because there are some trust issues, and you really beautifully outlined there. Are there any? I guess ethical issues would relate to the trust ones, but are there regulatory issues that right now that impact on its usage, or anything that might bar you legally from doing stuff?
So there is. It's an interesting area because technology is kind of moving at such pace that the regulators can't keep up with it. So ultimately, the first consideration here is data protection. So is synthetic data, it obviously can't be linked to an identifiable person. That's like half the point. But then it starts to fall outside a personal data regime. So then it starts to fall into a bit of a grey area. And in terms of kind of its ethical use, UK public sector guidance does flag a few potential issues. So transparency, the bias that I've talked about, the robustness, they're the kind of core ethical themes. And as we started kind of looking into this and thinking about use cases, for a while, it felt like we were walking around in the dark with no one to guide. And ultimately, last year, I think it was, SMR released what they call the SMR 20 questions. So SMR are like a global research association, just for those who are unaware. And the idea was that this was to aid users of AI in research. So this is any use of AI, not just specific to what we're talking about today. But I think they're really useful. And as a kind of guidance for anyone thinking about synthetic data and utilizing it for their research, I would strongly advise that these are looked at. You can easily download them from the internet. But the questions tend to fall into 5 areas. So questioning the company profile, as you would do with any agency that you're about to enter a relationship with. So what are their credentials? Questioning the AI capability and service, making sure that you understand what it is that is being generated and the process for that so that you can potentially start to explain it. Making sure you're clear on whether the service is trustworthy, ethical, and transparent. So how aligned have the company been on kind of the various ethical principles that we've talked about? What human oversight has been fed into the process? And that I think is absolutely key, because without the human, we're letting ourselves, we're leaving ourselves open to all kinds of potential errors. And then data governance protocols. So to really help buyers kind of understand if the supplier is appropriately aware of legal frameworks that govern these AI-based activities. And I think that is particularly relevant in highly regulated sectors, so the likes of healthcare, finance, etc. That one is key. So ultimately, I have no link to SMO, but it's just something that has helped us when considering, which suppliers we're partnering with for this type of thing. So just really useful to help to reassure us internally and then reassure our clients on the ethical and potential limitations.
Okay. So, I mean, you've laid out, that's a very clear set of guidelines, a set of advice, which is exactly what a global organization representing market research should be doing. So it sounds like they're speaking absolute sense. It sounds to me like you have some mixed feelings about synthetic data within marketing generally. So, I mean, in a minute, I'm going to ask you, what would you recommend people to do? How would you recommend they approach it? But I guess I'm going to play devil's advocate for a moment here and say, we're in this environment where, notwithstanding your concerns you've raised, in this environment where often marketing teams or agencies can't find the budget or don't have the time to do market research in any meaningful way, and so consequently, it's sidelined, it's reduced, it's denigrated, and so if synthetic data is offering you means to do this, to do something that is useful and contributory, and to be able to demonstrate a degree of market insight, isn't that better than nothing? Isn't it better to be doing that even with it, despite the limitations, than to be kind of pursuing, to just be going, oh, I haven't got time for this, and we'll just kind of carry on with something, or we'll just reduce the budget for that altogether. What do you think?
Yeah. I mean, look, I have stayed in this profession for so long because I think that insight is hugely valuable. And if you can't kind of if you can't go about it through traditional means, or if there are certain limitations, then absolutely some insight is going to be better than none. So my advice would be to absolutely start experimenting, trial this, but do so cautiously. So check carefully any source claiming that synthetic sample is a golden bullet. So you go in with your eyes open. Equally, though, be aware of the contrasting sources. So I think my advice for anyone where this is the answer, because there are no alternatives, is be clear on where the data that is used to create your synthetic sample has been sourced. Know what validation has been carried out so that you yourself can start to trust it. Because ultimately, if you're not clear on those two, and there is some kind of internal challenges with whatever the insights are that you're looking to present back to the business, then it's going to be really hard for people to buy in to the kind of power of this insight. So yeah, understand the limitations. And ultimately, yeah, just go in with your eyes open.
And that sounds like very wise words. In an ideal world, though, right? If you had working with a client who wanted to do some thought leadership, or indeed another kind of marketing, and budget and time perhaps weren't the pressing issues that they might have in some situations, to what extent or in what way would you advocate using synthetic data? Not at all, or in a cautious degree in some capacity? What would you say to people?
So for now, where we're at Adience is we are not advising using it yet. I think there will absolutely be a tipping point. I can't tell you whether that tipping point is 2 months or 2 years from now, because the rate of change is so significant. But I think the barriers that are in place, particularly when it comes to thought leadership, are a little too significant at the moment for us to be advising it as a solution. But what we are certainly doing is experimenting internally. So at the point where we believe that enough of those barriers are overcome, of course, there's always going to be limitations. There's a limitation with every data collection methodology and all data sets. So it's about the point at which those limitations start to reduce to a degree that we are comfortable with the authenticity and the accuracy. Then absolutely, we will be recommending it as a kind of hybrid using conjunction with human sample, because I think for now that is going to be the kind of most robust and trustworthy way of utilizing it. So at the moment, you're right in picking up. It's not that I think that, it's not got its use. I can see how it can be relevant, but I think if budgets do allow, there is still a huge amount to be said for the more conventional methods, which soon will, for all of us, be, I'm sure, augmented at the very least with synthetic data solutions as well.
I mean, it sounds like the perfect scenario here is that those more robust solutions are augmented, and therefore you're getting something more dynamic, perhaps more variety, more depth, more nuance, and potentially done at reduced costs because of the spread of it you can do. But you're not foregoing robustness of the traditional ones. You're not forgoing the dynamism or what are the proposals of these new solutions are coming on board. And that's exciting because it for me at least, because I think it puts it makes potentially market research, it puts it back into the center and means that people have to pay more attention to it and then do it more robustly. And that's, I mean, do you share that excitement? Is this a potentially, are we going to say a golden age potentially we're going into, or is it still too early to say if that's going to happen?
To share that excitement, I think it's interesting. There's quite a lot of studies that have been done doing exactly what you say, and then comparing the output from that to if we didn't have the additional synthetic sample, but we had a smaller base of those. And at the moment, I don't believe that the synthetic data kind of supplementary sample is providing any insight that can't be driven by the smaller sample. So you are right in terms of the barrier of sample size. So like more a perceived barrier in terms of, well, is that to be believed because it was only based on a sample of 100 versus 400? Yep, it can overcome that. But in terms of generating new news for a business, no. So I am excited or intrigued as to how that's going to change. And I do think the time will, we're not too far away from that time. But at the moment, I still maintain that we're not quite there yet.
Okay, so the watchword is apply with caution at this stage,
Yeah.
but keep looking at it, because for me, it's the other example of how exciting ways in which B2B might be changing in the future. So, Lynsey, I've really enjoyed talking to you today. I really appreciate your really thoughtful and thorough responses to the questions I've asked. And so thank you very much for taking the time to be part of the podcast and to share your insights.
Yeah, thank you for having me. And like I say, I mean, there's huge amounts out there for everybody to look at, but hopefully provided some insight on the topic today.
I think we should get you back in 2 years and see how it's changed, or even 6 months. Who knows?
Yeah.
Well, listen, thank you so much to Lynsey. I've really enjoyed this conversation. I hope you have too. If you like this and you're interested in the topic of trust in B2B marketing and thought leadership, there's loads of great content in other episodes that we recorded for it. So please don't forget to subscribe and to like and to share this episode. We'd love you to join us for the next one, which will be coming out next week. But for now, for me, thanks for joining us, and I hope you can join us again soon. Thank you.